Good afternoon, folks, and thank you so much for joining our webinar about the Dartmouth North Active Transportation Planning Project. My name is Chloe Kennedy, and I'm the HRM Project Manager for this planning project. And co-presenting with me today will be Garrett Donaher, who's our design engineer from Englobe. And all of our visual materials and our community engagement activities have been led by Upland Planning. So today we're going to be presenting some background on this planning project and also going through our route options and concepts. So it's important to note right off the bat that what we're going to be presenting today is still very much in the planning phase. So the goal of today is to show you some very high level concepts and routes that were based on what we heard from community feedback during our last round of consultation through July and August. So the purpose today is to get some feedback on some of the images that you're going to be seeing, and that will help us and our project management team determine what our preferred route is going to be for a walking and cycling route through Dartmouth North. So before we get into kind of the meat of the presentation, I'm going to go through some housekeeping items around using Microsoft Teams if this is anyone's first time using a Teams Live platform. So first, you must turn on your own closed captioning if you'd like to access the captions. So you can see the little CC button in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. There could be a little delay before you turn that on, but that's where you can find it if you need it. The second thing to note is that the session today is being recorded and will be posted to the Shape Your City website as part of the public record. So at any point you can leave the question and answer period. You can just do that by clicking the little leave button at the top right-hand corner of your screen. So throughout the presentation, we're going to be having some question and discussion periods with myself and Garrett so that you can ask questions directly about what you're seeing. So you can post a question or comment at any point in this little chat box in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, and questions will be answered after each section of the presentation. But at any point, if you have something you're thinking of and you don't want to forget it, you can just post it right in the chat. And if you don't want your name to be part of the public record, then, if you would like it to be part of the public record, then you can just post your first and last name with your question. But if you'd like it to remain anonymous, then you just simply click the bottom button, or you can just give yourself a nickname. And you just after you're done giving yourself your name, you type your question into the box that states ask a question at the bottom. So I hope that helps, and we look forward to hopefully getting some good discussion going around this project. So just to give you some very high level background on this, the reason why we're doing this project is because this is identified in two important pieces of policy that our department uses. The first is the Integrated Mobility Plan, which was approved by Regional Council in 2017. And in this Integrated Mobility Plan, there's laid out an all ages and abilities cycling network so that folks who live outside of the regional center can more easily access goods and services inside of Halifax. People living within the urban regional center can better get around by bike since there is quite a lot of different road users all crowded together in the urban core. This route through Dartmouth North was also identified in the Active Transportation Priorities Plan as part of this AAA All Ages and Ability regional network. So this project has two primary objectives, and the first one, and the most important one for us, is to improve conditions for people walking, cycling, and taking transit who live in Dartmouth North. So that's really the most important goal, as it is for any consultation that we do for any little segments of this network. It's really important for us to get feedback from people who live on the abutting streets because they're going to know what the main barriers are. And also, those are the folks who are going to be using these facilities the most. The second objective is to determine the route and roadway changes to complete this segment of the cycling network that connects the Burnside Greenway with Wise Road at Albro Lake. So I have a little map just so you can better get a sense of these two destinations. So at the top, you can see the connection to Burnside via the existing pathway. So right up near the corner of Lehman and Highfield, there's a paved pathway that ends at Lehman Drive near the elementary school. And that path will take you all the way to Burnside so that people can access that destination by foot or by bike. So we were looking to connect that multi-use pathway through that kind of green area outlined down to the brand new bike lanes that were just built on Wise Road that end at Albro Lake. Because one thing that we often get questions about with our bike lane facilities is that they kind of seem to end. You take a bike lane and then it kind of spits you out on a street that doesn't have facilities. So as streets get repaved, as they get recapitalized, we're putting these plans in place so that we can build facilities on the streets that connect to streets that already have cycling lanes, so that by the end, the objective is to have this interconnected network of cycling routes that are suitable for all ages and abilities. So that's the goal of this project, is to complete this segment of the network, and also, most importantly, to provide upgrades so that it's safer for people walking and cycling who live in this neighborhood. So just to give you a sense of where we are in this project, back in the spring, we had Garrett and some other project team members put together an existing conditions report. So this existing conditions report looked at some speed and volume data for cars and trucks traveling through some of the streets in this Dartmouth North area. We also looked at some survey data to get a sense of where the curbs were and where some of those infrastructure pieces were that will help us determine the feasibility of our final route. So after we did our existing conditions report that really looked at what's happening in Dartmouth North right now, then we were able to start phase 1 engagement that happened through July and August. So I'm going to give you a bit more detail about what we learned in phase 1 engagement a little later in the presentation. So through September, October, our project team developed some options for getting through the neighborhood based on what we heard. And we also developed an evaluation framework that we're going to use to choose the final route and what that's going to look like through Dartmouth North. So now that we've developed our options and our evaluation framework, we're now beginning phase 2 engagement. That's happening, of course, in late November into mid-December. So after we have feedback on the options that we developed, then it's time to evaluate the corridor options. And that's going to be done collaboratively with some stakeholders, both external stakeholders that we've been working with throughout this project in the Dartmouth North community. And it's also, and very importantly, going to be done in collaboration with our internal stakeholders here at HRM, our right-of-way engineers, our traffic engineers, our, fire truck operations, to really find a route that's going to be suitable and appropriate for general road operations, as well as making it safer for folks walking and biking. So the goal now is to have a 30% design of our preferred corridor finished by the end of this fiscal year. And from that 30% design, we'll have a recommendation to council for the final route going through the community of Dartmouth North. So that's kind of a high-level overview of the project and where it stands at this moment. So for phase 1 engagement that I mentioned happened through July and August, we really wanted to learn from people who live in Dartmouth North what their common destinations are. So where are they going? How are they getting there? And what are the barriers to getting to those locations by foot and by bike, so that we could get a sense of where routes are needed and where treatments are needed to make it safer along those routes. So to do this, we had stakeholder interviews with 8 different community stakeholder groups, including some not-for-profits and other departments. We also had lived experience interviews with 6 long-term residents, including youth, seniors, and people with disabilities, to get their perspective and really in-depth understanding of what it's like to travel through Dartmouth North by foot and by bike. We also had an online survey that was intended to catch, a few more people that live throughout the project area, and we had 130 responses. 32 paper surveys were filled out that were available at the Dartmouth North Library. We had 3 different pop-up engagements where we had a booth set up where people could fill out surveys and engage directly with the project team. And for anyone who lives in the Dartmouth North area, you may have seen some art bikes that we installed. So there's 3 throughout the community that have the Shape Your City page URL, and just generally to let people know that engagement is happening, because that's a really important piece of this. So we put together some general themes of what we heard in this phase of engagement through July and August. So some major themes was that there's need for better links to transit. So pedestrian usage and transit were very closely linked. So we, heard that there's more need for crosswalks through a lot of routes so that it's easier to access transit stops by foot. Also better connectivity between destinations so that it's easier to get there by foot and by bike. Need for sidewalks and crossings, better accessibility for folks who might be using assistive devices. There's definitely a need for traffic calming. That's one major theme that came through because you do have a lot of fast traffic, a lot of rolling stops through some of the big wide intersections that makes pedestrians and cyclists a little nervous. And we had Victoria Road as a theme in and of itself because it is a 4-lane arterial roadway that goes right in the middle of the area that we're looking at. So these were the major themes that we heard, and I'm just going to use a few examples to illustrate these themes so that you have a better sense of why we chose the routes that we did. Because as Garrett kind of walks us through some of the design treatments that we came up with, you might be able to kind of connect why those decisions were made. So Victoria Road, as I mentioned, came up as a major barrier for people walking and cycling. So as you can see on this section of Victoria Road, this is the intersection of Farrell and Victoria, and these are 2 transit stops. So for folks that are heading north from Farrell Street, coming up here, if you need to get to a transit stop on this side of the road, a lot of folks are crossing illegally and it's very, very unsafe because you do have very fast moving traffic. So this was one of the particular intersections that was identified as a need because the intersection at Albro Lake and Victoria is about 200 meters this way, and the one in this direction is 75 meters away at Primrose in Victoria. So that would mean walking 75 meters, crossing, and then another 75 meters in the other direction. So this is just one example that shows that better links to transit are needed, better connectivity between destinations, and better crossings and sidewalks. And this is a major theme that for any planning project that we do, we're trying to understand how to make HRM in general more friendly for folks walking and biking. So another theme that came up, or another example that illustrates some of the themes that came up, is the corner of Highfield and Victoria. So a lot of folks who are coming from Bedford, coming from Sackville on Victoria Road into downtown Dartmouth don't actually realize that this is the start of a very densely populated residential neighborhood. So to the left-hand side of the screen, kind of behind this treed-in area, you have a junior high school. And on the other side, to the right-hand side of your screen, you have an elementary school. So for people who live on Trinity Avenue and Nadia Drive, to the right-hand side of the screen, you have a lot of school children and parents who are accompanying youth that are crossing at this intersection. The Dartmouth North Library is also on Highfield Park Drive, as is one of the major transit hubs for the Dartmouth area, is also on Highfield Park Drive beside the library. So this example just illustrates some of these themes that came up in terms of fast traffic, accessibility, better links to transit, and connectivity. Another area that kind of outlines some of these themes is the corner of Pinecrest and Brule. So another design treatment that we're looking at is making local streets, such as Pinecrest, a little safer to be shared for bikes and cars. So here you can see that the curbs and the streets are in bad shape. They're planned for recapitalization, which is one of the points of this project, is so that when they get recapitalized, is there things we can do to make these safer for people biking or using other methods of transportation? Instead of just doing it exactly as it is and as it has been, are there things that we can do to change that? So for local streets, we would be looking at, adding in some speed bumps, narrowing up some of the intersections, especially for places like this that are in dire need of some accessibility treatments. We heard one story during public engagement of someone in an assistive device in a wheelchair that actually had toppled over because of some very deep potholes close to a curb cut. So it's really important for us to be looking at all road users and then making design decisions based around that and what we're hearing from folks walking and biking. So those are kind of three examples of areas that we heard from the public where improvements could be made for folks walking and biking. Based on this feedback, these are three, we are calling them priority routes through the Dartmouth North neighborhood, starting at Wise Road and Albro Lake at the bottom right-hand corner of the map, connecting through neighborhood streets, all the way up to the top left-hand section of the map at the Burnside Greenway at Highfield and Lehman. So Garrett's going to be walking us through each segment of these routes. And it's important to note that the final route that we take might not be one of the ones that we've identified as one continuous route. So it could be a section of the blue route and a section of the green route and a section of the pink route, because we have 10% concept designs for each of these. So it's really just a question of how we're presenting it and what the best route ends up being based on the feedback we get. So based on the surveys, based on the pop-ups we're doing, based on some conversation, hopefully, that we get started today, when we hear which sections of this would have more pros than cons, which sections would do the best at connecting important destinations and reducing barriers for people who are going to be cycling through the neighborhood. So I hope that helps to provide some background information and kind of give an overview of why we chose these priority routes. So with that, we're going to hand it over to Garrett Donaher to run us through some of the cross sections and designs.
Sorry, everyone, I was muted. Thank you very much, Lloyd, for handing things over. As I run through here, please feel free to type any questions you have in the Q&A box. And if it's kind of a generic question, we might move it to the end. But any questions that are relevant to a particular section, we'll definitely take them on right away as we go through. So this is what we've called Route 1. As Chloe mentioned, it is a concept at this point of kind of like a what if idea of what it would take to connect Wise Road to the Greenway via this route. So Albro Lake Road, up Victoria, and then across Highfield Park. So those are kind of three distinct sections. And on the next slide, we can start to dive into kind of what some of those sections look like. So up at the top of the community across Highfield Park Drive, this option looks at adding a multi-use trail on the south side of Highfield Park Drive. It says here on the northbound side, which is the kind of south side on the compass. So kind of keep that in mind as you're looking through. Northbound traffic is on that the community side rather than on the highway side. So there's very little change to Highfield Park Drive itself, just the addition of that multi-use pathway rather than a sidewalk on that side of the road. And this would go all the way from the current end of the Burnside Greenway by the school all the way down to Victoria Road. And in the next slide, we see Victoria Road. And so this continues that multi-use trail along the community side. So it's again on the northbound side of the road for traffic, which is the eastern side on the compass, or next to kind of the, I guess, the eastern portion of the community closer to Albro Lake. So this multi-use trail would run along the full length of Victoria from Highfield Park down to Albro Lake Road. There's a couple of transit stops it goes past through that section, so it will kind of wind in behind the transit stop so that it's not interfering with the shelter or kind of the waiting area for the buses. And so that kind of as it comes down provides that great connection. And then the next slide, we see it turns through an intersection here at Albro Lake Road. So in order to kind of make this connection, we come around the back of that last transit stop, kind of in the middle of this diagram. And then on the right-hand side of the diagram, you can see there's a trail crossing that replaces the regular pedestrian crosswalk. And that trail crossing takes us across Victoria Road onto the north side of Alvaro Lake Road, or the westbound vehicle lane side. So that runs us along there. So right at the intersection, the road would need to be widened a little bit in order to fit both travel lanes and the left turn lane and the new multi-use trail. So there's a little bit of widening that would happen here at the intersection. And then on the next segment of Alvaro Lake Road, kind of in the middle of the block between Victoria Road and Weiss, we would eliminate the on-street parking in order to minimize, how much along the side of the road is impacted by changing the sidewalk out to a multi-use path. So that section kind of continues down until we get to Wise Road, and then at Wise there's another left turn lane that comes in there. So again, the road would need to be widened a little bit at that point in order to accommodate this option. And then the trail would cross at that intersection to the bike lanes on Wise Road that were built this year. So that's kind of a quick rundown. It's a multi-use pathway, the full length of this route option, which is really nice for getting folks off the street into a more comfortable space, especially along the busier roads. So if you have any questions, feel free to drop them into the question and answer section. I'll give you a few seconds to do that. And if I don't see anything there, then I'm just going to continue right on to Route 2, where we'll play the intermission music. Okay, I don't see anything popping up. So if something pops up right away, then I'll come back to it. But otherwise, I'll wait and take it to the end. So Route 2, as shown here, has a couple different segments. It starts again at the Burnside Greenway and runs along Lehman Drive and then along Primrose throughout the neighborhood before creating a new crossing of Victoria Road right at the end of Farrell Street. And then as it passes by the Boys and Girls Club, then it goes into Farrell Street Park and uses the Farrell Street Park walkway link down to Wise. So Susie, I see your question there about bike lanes versus pathways. I'll take that one at the end because it's a more generic question. It's a really good one. So we'll do that. We'll do that one later. Route 2, if we want to continue to the next slide there, Chloe. The first segment along Lehman Drive here is a portion of a multi-use trail or multi-use pathway. So that connects to the existing Burnside Greenway. So it extends that pathway down along Lehman Drive before it turns into the neighborhood. So in order to fit that in between the existing homes, we've taken away one lane of parking. We've left one lane of parking in place, and then we have the multi-use trail. And then as the route turns into the neighborhood to cross kind of Primrose is the major. It also goes on Crystal there for a little while. We use bike lanes, so we take away parking on both sides of Primrose this time in order to fit in a bike lane. And that's a bike lane that's buffered by kind of a painted strip through this area in order to separate the cyclists from vehicle traffic, and then our sidewalks remain kind of on the side. Even. So if you want to go to the next one there, Chloe. Once we get to the end of Primrose, then we get to that crossing that I mentioned at the end of Farrell Street. So this crossing is south of the intersection. We do have a signalized intersection there at the end of Primrose at Victoria Road with kind of pedestrian signals like you would normally expect to see. But through the community engagement that we did in the first phase of this project, we found that there's a really strong demand for crossing kind of right at the end of Farrell Street, right at where the two transit stops are. There's kind of limited space on the west side of Victoria Road to make that pathway connection up to Primrose. So we found a really great solution here, widening out the median in the middle to provide a little bit of a safe refuge area, and creating a new crossing. So this would be controlled with some lights. It wouldn't be kind of a red, yellow, green traffic light. It might be the flashing beacons or the overhead kind of yellow ball flashers. But that kind of treatment here is what we would have to get people across at that really key crossing point for the neighborhood. We've also made a little bit of a change here at the end of Leahy Street, just to narrow it down a little bit to provide some more space where people are kind of approaching that crosswalk on Victoria Road, to give them a little bit more space there and feel a little more comfortable. And then if we continue on to the next segment, that'll take us through Farrell Street Park, with a multi-use trail along the road for the first little section in front of the Boys and Girls Club, and then the pathway would continue through the park down to Wise. So along this segment, there would be kind of some cleaning up. Some vegetation would need to be probably pruned away from the edges of the trails. The trail would be widened out a little bit to create a nice kind of comfortable cycling environment through this area. So that's kind of the rundown on Route 2. I see your question there about the big hill on Primrose. That's definitely something we're really concerned about, right at that end where kind of Primrose and Crystal connect up to Lehman. That hill is there. We have to deal with it on both this route and Route 3, which we'll talk to about in a moment. And that is part of that evaluation that Chloe mentioned earlier of, what can we do with the different routes? On this route, it does take a hit in our evaluation because of that hill. It's not really something that we can change about the route, but we can choose a different route based on to meet that grade. It is about 8% grade from kind of engineering terms, and we really don't like to see anything above 6% if we can all help it. And lower than that is obviously even better. So we are a little bit above our preferred range for the grades there on. Thanks very much for that question, Susie. Does anyone have any other questions about this route? Hearing nothing, I will move on as well. Thank you, Chloe. So Route 3 is another route that kind of crosses through the interior of the neighborhood, similar to Route 2, whereas Route 1 kind of went along the edge of the neighborhood a little bit more. So we start up at the Burnside Greenway again, and this time, rather than following through on Primrose as kind of the main connection, we follow through on Pinecrest Drive. And then we cross Victoria Road using the existing pedway that crosses there beside Brule Street Park at the end of Brule Street. And then we connect down from the elementary school to Farrell Street, and we finish out the route going through Farrell Street Park, just the same as we did with Route 2. So if we can start out on the next page. So as this route starts, it comes off the Burnside Greenway and then makes kind of a cut through an existing pathway connection over to True North Crescent. And then it kind of winds its way through the neighborhood along True North and Farthington and Pinecrest and Crystal Drive. There is that little bit of hill on Crystal Drive that we saw as well on the last route. And then it finishes out on Brule Street. So all those cross sections, all those streets are a little bit different. So at its most constrained, the street would look like this. It would be a local street bikeway, so there would be signage, there would be some traffic calming features perhaps, and there would be narrower lanes than there are today that are shared between vehicles and bicyclists. The sidewalks would be widened out a little bit to provide a nicer space for pedestrians as well. And in some locations, the distance between the property lines, that right of way available for the road, would be wide enough to provide a lane of parking, but it wouldn't happen everywhere. So we wanted to show kind of the most strained cross section with this diagram. So that is kind of how we wind our way through the neighborhood on this side. Then once we cross over Victoria Road on the next segment, then we get to Alfred and Catherine Street. That connects us from the end of the pedway down to Farrell Street. And so these streets, similar to the last one, would be shared between vehicles and cyclists. They are a little bit quieter in terms of vehicles, but they also are immediately adjacent to school. So it's a little bit different context there, where we would have parents picking up and dropping off children at different times of day. So similar to the last segment, we would look at some improvements at the intersections, a little bit of traffic calming and some signage to kind of really highlight this area as a local street bikeway. And then, as I mentioned, we would finish out this route with a multi-use path that would connect us through Farrell Street Parkway down to Wise. And then to those bike lanes, there would be a treatment there at the intersection. That's a quick rundown of the Route 3. These three routes, each different segment that we went through, all has its own kind of pros and cons. And so as we go through the evaluation and the feedback, might pick up on the feedback we hear from one area and apply it to kind of the project in general to kind of create a hybrid option that comes out of this as the preferred from the community feedback. We're really trying to present options to get that conversation going and make sure we understand the issues. The grade, as I see your question there, Susie, on the grade at the pedway ramp, it is a little bit higher as well. I don't have the number off the top of my head, but the ramp on the elementary side is definitely something that is a detractor, if you will, for using that pedway as a cycling route as well. And just in terms of accessibility, like the overall goal of this project is to have that all ages and abilities facility. And so part of that, as Chloe was mentioning earlier, is making sure that it's an accessible route. So there is that concern along that route for sure. Is there any other questions about this one in particular? Yeah, so Susie's got a question. Again, it's kind of a general question, but we're at the end anyway, so we'll take it. We have, there was originally in this project a route that went all along Albro Lake Road from Weiss all the way up to Lehman, and then the full length of Lehman up to the Burnside Greenway. So after we finished that kind of phase one of public consultation, we ended up with like 6 different candidate routes that we were looking at, trying to figure out which options were going to be best. And so as part of trying to figure out and synthesize that phase one consultation into a set of 3 routes that we could kind of develop into a concept and move forward and get more feedback on, that particular route from Weiss along Albro Lake to Lehman and then up Lehman dropped off the list as something that was kind of further down the scale of priority and feasibility, and so that list or that route came off the list just because it wasn't in the top 3 that we had available to look at. And I will come back to your earlier question, Susie, about the bike lanes versus multi-use pathways. These different route options have bike lanes in some and multi-use pathways in all 3 in different segments. And then they have local street bikeways as well. What particular facility is selected depends a lot on the context of the particular area and the space that's available. And then the goal of the project, the adjacent land uses, kind of all these factors come into play. So on let's choose an example of Primrose. Primrose in our route option number 2 has bike lanes on it. Primrose could also be served by multi-use trails or pathways. It could also be served by a local street bikeway. What facility takes that on, takes that segment on, really depends a lot on what we hear based on the feedback today. If people really like the multi-use pathway options, then we might skew that way. If people really prefer the bike lane options, then we would skew that way. It's really about what the community would like to see. In some areas, a multi-use pathway just makes more sense in terms of continuity of facilities. So an example there would be at the end of Lehman coming off the Burnside Greenway. It's a multi-use pathway already. So where we make that transition from a multi-use pathway to a bike lane, it is a question. And in that particular area, because we're trying to preserve some parking along that section of road for the community uses, we thought that we would better serve that area with a multi-use pathway. So it's really context dependent, and we really hope to respond to the public feedback that we hear quite a bit as we take the project from these route options that we have in front of us now and the consultation process that we're going through, and kind of put that all together with an evaluation and spit it out the other end with a preferred kind of route that may or may not look exactly like any one of these particular options that we're looking at right now. That's all the questions I see in the question box, so I'll hand it back to you, Chloe, to take it on, but feel free to throw some more questions in there and we'll get to them afterwards for sure.
Great. Thank you so much, Garrett, for running us through an explanation of our 3 priority routes. So I'm just going to chat through some next steps before we get to our final discussion period about the project in general. So just to get you a sense of what's going to be coming up in the next few months for the Dartmouth North project, we're going to be wrapping up consultation for this project on December 19th. So in about 3 weeks from now, we'll be finished. And then we're going to be putting together as we did last time, the survey data, the interview data, the stakeholder meeting results, all of the different engagements that we're doing. We're going to compile all of that feedback into a what we heard report. And each what we heard report has a street by street summary talking about what some of the issues are on each of the streets. So the what we heard report that we're going to have done in January is going to be a crucial document for us in identifying the pros and cons for each segment of each of the priority routes. Because as Garrett said, the final 30% design recommendation that we put forward could be, a section of each of those. So it's really about just looking at the pros and cons of each kind of facility on each part of the route. So yeah, those results will help us evaluate the routes, as will our evaluation framework. And the evaluation framework talks about, impacts to parking, grades, as Garrett mentioned, some of those steep hills, comfort and safety for people walking and biking. So we do have a robust process for trying to determine what the final route will look like. So yeah, each route is going to be evaluated based on various technical and community preference criteria. Like I said, road safety, sense of comfort, impact to traffic, benefits to transit, and a complete functional plan will be, we're aiming for the end of February to have our section done. So I should clarify that when we say 30% design, that's still pretty high level, because you think of the design process as 100% of the design would mean that route is taken down to the centimeter, around the, utilities and existing curbs. So that level of detail up to 100% is done during detailed design. Our job is to create this high level 30% design that we're recommending so that our engineers at HRM can build that preliminary and detailed design around what we're doing. So we're getting it to 30%. Garrett and the other engineers on our team will be putting that forward. So it's not down to the centimeter of what's happening on the street, but it's basically a proof of concept. It's showing feasibility and it's showing public support for how the route that we put forward is going to benefit folks who live in this community for accessing destinations and making it safer and more comfortable for walking and biking. So detailed design and construction will be happening within this 5-year budget cycle. Which exact season it gets built in, whether it's 2023, 2024, depends on a lot of different factors. So at this stage, we just know that we'll be handing it off for preliminary and detailed design and construction, but we'll certainly keep the public informed as to our targets for those next steps. Finally, we're going to be sharing what we learn with other city departments and other transportation project managers, just so that everyone's informed as to what we heard during public consultation, so that hopefully improvements can be made on other streets in the project area that wouldn't necessarily be on our direct route that would connect Wise Road at Albert Lake up to the Burnside Greenway, but we could say, hey, you know, there's big need for slowing traffic down on this section of street. So when that gets recapitalized, maybe think about narrowing it a little bit. So there's also recommendations that we can put forward since we're going through this, robust public consultation process. So what we hear, we are going to be seriously taking into account. So we'd love to hear from folks around these 3 routes, or even hearing ideas for how these routes could connect in other ways, talking about some of the benefits and disadvantages of each option that Garrett had walked us through, which routes best connect community destinations, or if there's anything missing that we haven't talked about yet. And just to kind of get the conversation started, as an example of kind of balancing the different needs and interests that we've heard so far. Garrett was mentioning during the last route about the multi-use pathway that comes out at the Burnside Greenway connecting to Lehman Street, for example. So in that option, for the blue option at the top of your map there, we did recommend a multi-use pathway along there to preserve parking on one side of the street. Because one piece of feedback we heard was that you have a lot of school children and cyclists sharing the road with cars, with a lot of vehicular traffic. So the idea of having this wider pathway on one side is to remove the cyclists and the pedestrians from the line of cars. But already some really strong feedback that we're getting is that there's taking away even one row of parking along Lehman Street would be have a really negative impact on a lot of residents that live along the street and for some community organizations that are based along that street. So when we hear that, that helps us determine, okay, there's some really strongly identified disadvantages that will rank in our evaluation. So it is important that we reach out to different groups as well. So we're working with the folks at the mosque and the folks at Between the Bridges and the North Grove Food Center to try to get robust stakeholder feedback as well on the advantages and disadvantages to some of these routes and sections that we've identified. Yeah. So maybe I'll wait just another minute to see if we have any other comments coming through.
Can you hear me if I pipe up? Excellent, thank you. There was a question there that came through as well about prioritizing cars and active transportation. So in our kind of evaluation framework that we put together for this project, we're looking at different criteria. So we're looking at, what kind of a pedestrian environment does a scenario create? What kind of cycling environment does it create? Is transit accommodated? Will people be able to, bike or walk to transit and make that connection better? Vehicles and traffic are a couple of the criteria in there. They account for about 18% of the total possible score is assigned to kind of vehicle, truck traffic, and that sort of stuff. So they are considered, but they're definitely not considered above and beyond active transportation. This is an active transportation project. We're trying to create some really great facilities for people to be able to walk and cycle within the neighborhood. So that's where our focus is for sure. And the school streets for Lehman, absolutely. There's 3 different schools along our routes here, the elementary schools and the junior high. And what happens around those streets is like a critical piece of our consideration for these routes throughout making those connections and understanding that, you know, there are pickups and drop-offs that need to happen. There are people that are walking and cycling to school. There are buses that are coming. There's a lot of activity around school sites throughout the day, and we need to make sure that the design and the facilities that we select accounts for that and kind of appreciates that as we go through. So definitely something. Thanks very much for that question.
And if I can hop in here as well, Siobhan, if I'm able to jump in, I will mention as well that. So thank you, Garrett, for commenting on you know, our process for prioritizing access to school spaces with vehicular traffic, which is really important, but also considering the comfort and safety of pedestrians and cyclists. So for the consultation around this project, we really wanted to reach folks who live within this kind of boundary that you can see outlined in blue. And to do that, we actually mailed out a letter to 5,000 residents with the direct line to this cell phone right here and my email address here at HRM. So that we could really try to reach every resident. Literally every resident was mailed a letter, whether they lived in detached houses or apartment buildings, that outlined these 3 routes and also some opportunities to participate. So I have received some phone calls as a result of that mail out, and it's been really important feedback that we've been getting, because we know that it's coming directly from folks who live in this area, and there is a lot of concern for conflicts between pedestrians, especially in car traffic. Because one of the things that we noted, especially for Victoria Road and Highfield, is that all of the what we would call design cues, so that would be the number of car lanes, the width of those car lanes, all of those design cues tell drivers that they have, you know, the right of way, that they have the power in those situations. So you see a lot of speeding and a lot of almost aggressive encounters that we heard reported between cars, you know, revving their engines or squealing on the brakes for pedestrians. So we're really looking, and that's what we've heard from folks who live directly in the Dartmouth North neighborhoods. So we're trying to balance out with some of these treatments some of these larger design cues through these very car-centric streets, especially Highfield and Victoria. So as much as we can as part of this active transportation planning project, that's why we're kind of looking at adding in potentially intersection designs for potentially at Farrell and Victoria or Highfield and Victoria to try to account and create a safer environment for pedestrians along streets that were very much designed with cars having first priority. So it's a bit of a unique area within the regional center for that reason. So I'm not sure, Garrett, if we have any other questions or comments in the...
Yeah, there's a couple extra comments in there. Not
Excellent.
really questions, but some comments there. Definitely the kind of the fundamental conflict between space to park your car on the street and other users is something we hear on every single project, and is always very, very important for the person that likes to park their car there, and is rarely important for the person that's trying to walk past. It's something that we have to deal with on every project, and striking that balance depends a lot on the feedback we hear from the community and the context of that street again. I think just echoing your comments there, Chloe, about walking and cycling environment on Victoria and Highfield are not nice right now. That's definitely something that we've heard about before, and is kind of self-evident if you spend any time at all on those streets. So that's a couple comments there. Thanks again for those.
And a common, if I can jump in here, a common question that we've received throughout the consultation process from residents who live, within this blue area, is around Victoria Road. And if there's any plans in the future to address some of the issues with Victoria Road in terms of its width and the speed of traffic going through what is primarily a residential neighborhood with schools on either side. And we only have 2 safe crossings within a 600-meter stretch of arterial highway in a residential neighborhood. So any larger adjustments to Victoria Road are beyond the scope of this active transportation planning project, because what we're doing is looking at how can we add in facilities here and there, make some tweaks to some of the local streets to make it safer. But as far as any major corridor redesigns, that would go to another department within HRM. But if you live within this project boundary and that's something you're interested in, you can always talk to your councillor to request that, but it is beyond the scope of this project. So maybe we'll wait just another minute or two in case we have any other questions or comments that are coming in.
Sure. While we're waiting, I'll make note that there was another comment that came in just again about the hill on Primrose and Crystal, about cycling along that. And when you hit a stop sign, if you're heading uphill and you hit a stop, you lose all your momentum. And that's something that is interesting actually about cycling design that doesn't happen in designing for vehicles or for pedestrians the same way. That ability to maintain momentum as you travel along a route is really important. So sharp turns for cyclists, the stop signs, the conflict points has kind of an outsized effect for cyclists that isn't experienced in the same way for vehicles or for pedestrians. So it's something that's definitely on our mind as we're going through kind of design decisions and trade-offs, and looking at, traffic calming treatments. Like I mentioned when we were running through the routes, is it possible to incorporate a traffic calming treatment at a particular area so that we can remove a stop sign along that path of the cycling route? So there's different tools that we have available to us like that. That will definitely be a factor in kind of the next step of this project once we kind of decide on which route we're going to detail out in a little bit more work and engineering and design. And that's a really valuable comment to bring to the forefront there. So thanks again.
Well, I'll jump in here again, and I'll just would request, Garrett, that you would just type in my email address into the chat there, because I certainly look forward to, we can provide, I'm the primary contact person for this project. So if any folks think of a question afterwards, or maybe you're watching a recording of this webinar afterwards if you weren't able to make it here between 12 and 1, I'm really eager at this point to receive contact from folks who might have thoughts or questions. So please get in touch if you're able. Also, if you're just tuning in, we do have information about this project available at shapeyourcityhalifax.ca. So this information, all of it that we've gone through today, all of the detailed maps, all of the cross sections are all available on our public survey, which is all the way to the bottom of the Dartmouth North Active Transportation Planning Shape Your City page. So as follow-up to this webinar, please check out the Shape Your City page or shoot me an email if you'd like to have a chat about any of these pieces. And just to mention as well that some upcoming engagement we have, we're going to be doing another one of these webinars this coming Wednesday from 12 to 1. And we're also having another pop-up event. So that pop-up event is going to be tomorrow evening at the Dartmouth North Library on Highfield Park. So if you happen to be in the library, drop in, check out our booth. We're also going to be having some of these maps up on easels at the public library. And if you're not able to fill out the online survey for whatever reason, we also have a stack of paper surveys that are located at the Dartmouth North Library as well. Great. So thank you so much for attending the webinar today and sending us these great questions. And I'll sign off. And Garrett, if you have any final words or if there's any final comments there in the chat box, I'll hand it over to you.
All good here. Thank you very much. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.